Welcome to Watch the Book. Today we present The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, published in 1890. Join us as we explore a dark tale of vanity, youth, and a corrupted soul. In the fragrant, rose-scented studio of Basil Hallward, Lord Henry Wotton relaxed on a divan, watching the artist gaze at his latest and greatest masterpiece. Clamped to the easel stood a full-length portrait of a young man possessing extraordinary personal beauty. Basil smiled at the graceful form he had captured. Lord Henry lazily declared it the best thing Basil had ever done, urging him to exhibit it at the Grosvenor. Basil firmly refused, claiming he had put too much of himself into it. Amused, Lord Henry pointed out that Basil looked nothing like the ivory-and-rose beauty of the portrait. Basil explained that Dorian Gray was a fateful artistic inspiration to him. Basil confessed a deep, almost terrifying fascination with Dorian, dreading that the world might see his soul laid bare on canvas. He preferred to keep his obsession a hidden secret. Suddenly, the butler announced that Dorian Gray had arrived. Before entering, Basil pleaded with Lord Henry not to influence the boy, fearing his cynicism would ruin Dorian's purity. Dorian sat at the piano, a vision of frank blue eyes and crisp gold hair. Upon meeting Lord Henry, he was instantly charmed by the older man's melodious voice and graceful detachment. As Basil painted, Lord Henry began his seductive philosophy, telling Dorian that self-denial was a tragedy and that the only true path was to yield to every temptation and hidden desire. He warned Dorian that his youth and beauty would rapidly fade, leaving him old, wrinkled, and hollow-cheeked. He urged the boy to live fully now and squander nothing of his golden days. Dorian listened, open-eyed and wondering, feeling completely bewildered as entirely fresh influences stirred within him. Life suddenly became fiery-colored and intensely thrilling. When Basil finally finished the painting, Dorian gazed at his own likeness. The full reality of Lord Henry's warning flashed across his mind, piercing him with a sharp pang of deep pain. Realizing he would grow old and hideous while the picture remained forever young, Dorian passionately cried out, wishing that the painted image could bear the heavy burden of age instead.
If it were I who was to be always young and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. Yes, I would give my very soul for that incredible miracle to occur.
Basil was horrified by Dorian's sudden outburst and offered to destroy the canvas with a palette knife, but Dorian fiercely stopped him, declaring that he was now in love with the art. Despite Basil's earnest pleas for him to stay, Dorian chose to leave with Lord Henry to attend the theater. The painter collapsed on the sofa, feeling an acute, tragic sense of deep loss. A month later, Dorian sat in Lord Henry's luxurious library, eagerly recounting how he had discovered a brilliant young actress named Sibyl Vane in a dingy, absurd little Eastern theater. He described her as the loveliest thing he had ever seen, with violet eyes and a voice like a flute. He had watched her play Juliet and was entirely captivated by her flawless performance. Lord Henry smiled subtly, delighted that his cynical words had already shaped the boy's desires. He agreed to join Dorian and Basil at the theater to witness this so-called divine genius. In her dingy sitting room, Sibyl Vane joyously confessed her love for the man she only knew as Prince Charming. Her weary mother urged caution, hoping the mysterious suitor was very wealthy. Her thick-set, protective brother, James Vane, prepared to sail for Australia. He scowled with deep suspicion, vowing that if this gentleman ever wronged his sister, he would track him down. Walking through the park, Sibyl prattled happily about her future, completely oblivious to her brother's fierce jealousy. James watched the passing carriages, his heart leaden with dark fear. As James departed for his long voyage, he cornered his mother, forcing her to admit she was never married to his father. He left with a final, murderous threat aimed at Sibyl's rich lover. At a lavish dinner, Dorian excitedly announced to his friends that he was engaged to marry Sibyl. Basil was deeply shocked by the sudden news, while Lord Henry found it endlessly fascinating. The three men arrived at the crowded, sweltering theater. Dorian proudly expected Sibyl to enchant them, but when she stepped onto the stage, her movements were curiously listless and rigid. To Dorian's absolute horror, Sibyl's acting was completely artificial and wooden. She recited the beautiful romantic lines with the painful, hollow precision of an untalented schoolgirl. The unruly audience hissed and groaned as the play dragged on. Lord Henry and Basil departed early in polite dismay, leaving Dorian utterly crushed, hiding his pale face in his trembling hands. Rushing backstage, Dorian found Sibyl radiant with joy. She explained that his true love had awakened her to the sham of the theater, making it utterly impossible for her to fake passion now. Disgusted and disillusioned, Dorian coldly rejected her, declaring she had killed his love by losing her art. He callously abandoned her as she crouched on the floor, weeping and begging him. Wandering the foggy streets till dawn, Dorian finally returned home. In the dim light of his room, he glanced at Basil's portrait and noticed a subtle, cruel alteration twisting its red lips. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief, but the canvas had undeniably changed. The magical, terrifying wish had come true. The painted face would bear his sins while his own flesh remained untouched. A wave of remorse washed over him. Resolving to resist temptation and make amends, he drew a screen over the corrupted image and vowed to return to Sibyl Vane and marry her the very next day. Awakening late the next afternoon, Dorian wrote a passionate letter of apology to Sibyl. However, Lord Henry arrived soon after, bringing the devastating news that the young girl had just died. She had swallowed a deadly poison in her dressing room. Dorian was dazed with horror, feeling like a murderer, yet strangely detached from the tragedy, viewing it as a beautiful, dramatic end. Under Lord Henry's soothing, poisonous influence, Dorian accepted Sibyl's death as a wondrous artistic fragment. He chose to attend the opera that night, burying his fleeting guilt in pleasure. The next morning, Basil arrived to console his friend, only to find Dorian completely indifferent. The artist was horrified by the boy's callousness and begged to see the masterpiece once more. Panic-stricken that Basil would discover the supernatural corruption, Dorian fiercely barred him from looking at the canvas, threatening to sever their long friendship if he dared touch the screen. To ensure the dreadful secret remained safely hidden, Dorian ordered the heavy portrait carried to the desolate, locked schoolroom at the top of the house, draping it securely in a purple pall. Lord Henry sent Dorian a mysterious, yellow-bound French novel detailing the extravagant sins of a young Parisian. This poisonous book became Dorian's dark guide, mesmerizing his willing soul. Years passed, Dorian remained miraculously youthful and fair, while the portrait in the locked room absorbed the hideous decay of his escalating debaucheries, growing increasingly bestial and old. He indulged heavily in every sensory pleasure, collecting rare jewels, exotic perfumes, and ancient tapestries, attempting to escape the creeping, haunting fear of his own undeniable corruption. Dark rumors swirled through London high society regarding his scandalous behavior. Former close friends shunned him, and pure reputations were utterly ruined simply by associating with his name. On the eve of his 38th birthday, Dorian encountered Basil in the dense fog. The painter, about to depart for Paris, insisted on warning his former muse about the dreadful rumors spreading. In the quiet library, Basil pleaded with Dorian to deny the horrible charges, wishing he could see the man's hidden soul. With a bitter laugh, Dorian agreed to show him the terrible absolute truth. Dorian led the artist up the dark stairs to the neglected schoolroom. Tearing the curtain away, he revealed the grinning, loathsome face of the portrait, mutated by decades of unpunished wickedness. Basil collapsed in terror, recognizing his own brushwork beneath the leprous decay. He begged Dorian to kneel and pray for desperate forgiveness, horrified by the monstrous evil staring back at him. An uncontrollable, raging hatred seized Dorian. Snatching a knife from the chest, he lunged at the kneeling painter, stabbing him repeatedly until the man lay dead in a widening, dark pool of blood. Feeling strangely calm, Dorian locked the dead man inside the room and slipped out to establish an alibi. He awoke the next morning with a cool head, fully determined to conceal his gruesome crime. He summoned Alan Campbell, a brilliant former friend whose life he had previously ruined. When the grim scientist arrived, Dorian callously demanded his help to utterly destroy the murdered corpse. Alan fiercely refused to be complicit in such horror. With a ruthless smile, Dorian wrote a blackmail note exposing Alan's darkest secret, forcing the terrified chemist to completely submit to him. Supplied with nitric acid and heavy equipment, Alan spent 5 agonizing hours in the locked room above. When he emerged, pale and trembling, the ghastly, silent thing at the table had vanished. That evening, Dorian attended a sparkling dinner party at Lady Narborough's. Despite his flawless elegance and easy smiles, his nerves throbbed violently with the suppressed terror of his dark deed. Lord Henry noticed Dorian's unusual distraction and playfully questioned his whereabouts. Paranoia gripped Dorian, who abruptly excused himself, rushing home to burn Basil's remaining belongings. Craving absolute oblivion to drown his gnawing conscience, Dorian unlocked an ornate cabinet and retrieved a secret stash of opium. He dressed in common clothes and fled into the cold, rainy night. His hansom rattled through the gloomy labyrinthine streets toward the sordid eastern docks. He sought the loathsome dens where the memory of old sins could be obliterated by the madness of the new. Inside the squalid, smoke-filled room, Dorian found twisted figures lying in grotesque postures. He felt entirely alienated, especially when a haggard, mocking woman called him Prince Charming. The name awakened a drowsy sailor from his stupor. As Dorian hurried back into the drizzling rain, the burly man pursued him into a dark archway, violently pinning him against the damp brick wall. The attacker revealed himself as James Vane, swearing deadly vengeance for his sister Sibyl's tragic death. He pressed a loaded revolver to Dorian's head, giving him 1 minute to make his peace. Paralyzed by sudden fear, Dorian used his wits. He commanded James to look closely at his face under the dim street lamp, pointing out that he looked like a mere boy, far too young for the crime. Deceived by the miraculous, unstained youth of his captive, James lowered his weapon and apologized. Dorian quickly vanished into the dense fog, narrowly escaping the furious grasp of total doom. Moments later, the haggard woman approached the confused sailor, swearing before God that the young man was indeed the wicked Prince Charming, unchanged by time thanks to a dark, devilish bargain. A week later, Dorian hosted an elegant gathering at his sprawling country estate, Selby Royal. He flirted gracefully with the clever Duchess of Monmouth while Lord Henry offered cynical commentary. While fetching exotic orchids from the conservatory, Dorian suddenly unleashed a stifled groan and collapsed heavily onto the tiled floor, struck down by a terrifying, paralyzing wave of sheer panic. Pressed against the glass of the conservatory window, pale and relentless, he had seen the thick-set, vengeful face of James Vane. Dorian spent the next day trembling in his room, hunted and trapped. Gradually convincing himself that the spectral face was merely a phantom born of his own guilt-ridden imagination, Dorian ventured out to join his esteemed guests for a crisp morning shooting party. Walking alongside Sir Geoffrey, Dorian felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of pity for a hare darting from the brush. He cried out, urging the shooter to let the beautiful little living creature escape. Sir Geoffrey laughed and fired into the thicket, but the shot was followed by the scream of a dying man. The beaters dragged a lifeless body from the bushes, shocking the aristocratic party. Dorian was overwhelmed by a dark presentiment, feeling the monstrous wings of death wheeling around him. Lord Henry dismissed his fears, casually writing off the fatal accident as mere clumsiness. Retreating to his room, Dorian packed his bags, desperate to flee the ill-omened estate. Just then, his headkeeper arrived, reporting that the dead man was not a local beater, but an unknown sailor. A wild, desperate hope fluttered within Dorian's chest. He mounted his horse and galloped madly to the home farm, where the corpse lay in an empty, dimly lit stable under a spotted handkerchief. When the servant pulled the cloth away, Dorian recognized the rough, weathered features of James Vane. Tears of immense relief filled his eyes, knowing his relentless pursuer was finally dead. Months later, Dorian dined with Lord Henry, boldly declaring that he had started a new, virtuous life. He proudly shared how he had recently spared an innocent country girl named Hetty from ruin. Lord Henry mocked this grand renunciation, suggesting the girl's heart was broken and that Dorian's supposed virtue was merely a novel sensation, another selfish variation of his endless vanity. Refusing to accept the cynical critique, Dorian asked about the latest London gossip. Lord Henry noted the public was still entirely obsessed with the mysterious, unresolved disappearance of Basil. Dorian casually asked what Henry would say if he confessed to murdering the artist. Lord Henry laughed it off, declaring crime too vulgar for a gentleman and finding the very notion entirely absurd. The conversation drifted as Lord Henry lamented his own aging, praising Dorian's flawless, unchanging youth. He urged the boy to continue treating his beautiful life as a perfectly composed sonnet. Dorian played a melancholic nocturne on the piano, troubled by the assertion that he could never truly change. He left his friend with a heavy heart, returning to the lonely silence of his grand home. Pacing his library, Dorian felt a wild longing for his unstained boyhood. He realized his beauty had been his ruin, a glittering mask that allowed his corrupt, selfish soul to fester in utter secrecy. He shattered the ornate mirror Lord Henry had given him, rejecting his physical perfection. He hoped that his recent good deed with Hetty might have begun to heal the hideous scars on his hidden soul. Taking a lamp, he crept upstairs to the locked schoolroom to inspect the canvas. Instead of improvement, he saw a new look of cunning hypocrisy in the eyes, and the blood on the hands seemed fresher. He realized his supposed renunciation was driven only by vanity and curiosity. The portrait remained a terrifying conscience, a haunting record of his irredeemable sins that he could no longer endure. Determined to be entirely free of his past, Dorian grabbed the very knife that had murdered Basil. He decided to destroy the painted image, believing it would finally kill his monstrous, dual life. He lunged forward and viciously stabbed the picture. A horrible, agonizing cry rang out from the locked room, echoing through the dark house and startling the sleeping servants from their beds. Two gentlemen passing through the quiet square below heard the terrifying shriek and alerted a nearby policeman. They waited outside as the frantic servants tried to break into the sealed upper room. Unable to force the heavy door, the footmen climbed onto the roof and dropped onto the balcony. Breaking through the old windows, they cautiously entered the dreadful chamber, holding their breath. Hanging on the wall, completely restored to its original, breathtaking perfection, was the magnificent portrait of their master in all the pristine wonder of his flawless, exquisite, untarnished youth. Lying on the floor beneath the painting was a dead man in evening dress, a knife plunged deep into his heart. His face was shockingly withered, heavily wrinkled, and thoroughly loathsome to behold. The horrified servants stared at the hideous, unrecognizable corpse. It was not until they examined the heavy jeweled rings on its decaying fingers that they realized it was Dorian Gray himself. Thank you for watching. If you were captivated by this dark tale of vanity and consequence, please subscribe to watch the book for more beautifully crafted retellings of classic literary masterpieces.